3 short presentations, videos. And believe it or not, we're going to cover 3 books of the Torah. So we're going to cover Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in one class session. So that's quite a feat, I think. Pretty good summary. Again, the big picture approach here. And so just a couple of introductory comments before we jump into those videos. So let's just start again with Leviticus. And I think I mentioned either last week or the week before that the names in our Bibles of, actually not just in the Old Testament, sometimes in the New Testament, there's a little bit of history to those, why those names are there. They're not necessarily, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls or whatever, and they, at the top of of whatever book you look at, whether it was Leviticus or even Matthew, something from the New Testament, didn't have necessarily that title there, and so those were added over the years. And so Leviticus, as I mentioned, I mentioned that in the Old Testament, a lot of the names of the books are derived from the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which would have been very familiar to the first century Christians and the apostles and disciples, and Jesus. And so Leviticus, that is a Greek translation, and the Hebrew there, if you translated from Hebrew to English, is something like, and he called. So Leviticus, more in Hebrew, would be and he called. So, and we'll kind of see why that makes sense as we go through. Numbers, the book of Numbers is when I was reading about that, it's kind of an unfortunate translation in the English. The Hebrew there is actually in the wilderness, and that actually makes sense because Numbers is really about the Israelites traveling through the wilderness, and Numbers is the English translation of a Greek word, so it's kind of an unfortunate naming there in some ways. And then Deuteronomy, the Hebrew for that is these are the words. So these are the words. So in the Greek translation, Deuteronomy means repetition of the law, or some people refer to it as the second law, because a lot of the laws that Moses gave are repeated in Deuteronomy. So we have Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And again, the big theme here is continuing where humans are rebellious, and God has a plan to redeem his people. And we see the holiness of God along with his plan for bringing us back into a relationship with him. So I'll save the rest of my comments for afterwards. So we're going to go ahead and start with Leviticus, and again, kind of keep your ears open for the big themes here, and then we'll hopefully have time for some discussion after these videos. Go ahead, Jerry.
The book of Leviticus. It's the 3rd book of the Bible, and it's set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited Israel into a covenant relationship. Now, they had quickly rebelled and broke that covenant, and God wanted for his glorious presence to come and live right in the midst of Israel in the form of this tabernacle. But Israel's sin has damaged the relationship. So, at the end of the previous book, Exodus, Moses, as Israel's representative, could not even enter God's presence in the tent. The book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of this fundamental problem. It says, the Lord called to Moses from the tent. So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to this holy God? That's what this book is all about. How God is graciously providing a way for sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. Now, let's pause for a second and explore this really important idea that God is holy. It's fundamental to understanding this book. The word holy means simply to be set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart from all other things because of his unique role as the creator of all, as the author of life itself. And so if God is holy, then the space around God is also holy. It's full of his goodness and his life and purity and justice. So, if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to live in God's holy presence, they too need to become holy. Their sin has to be dealt with. Thus, the book of Leviticus. Now, the book has a really amazing symmetrical design. It explores the three main ways that God helps Israel to live in his presence. The outer sections are descriptions of the rituals Israel was to practice in God's holy presence. The next inner sections focus on the role of Israel's priests as mediators between God and Israel. And inside of that are two matching sections that focus on Israel's purity. And then right here at the center of the book, there's a key ritual, the Day of Atonement, that brings the whole book together. The book concludes with a short section where Moses calls on Israel to be faithful to this covenant. Let's dive into the book. The first section explores the 5 main types of ritual sacrifices that Israel was to perform. 2 of these were ways that an Israelite could say thank you to God by offering back to God these symbolic tokens of what God has first given them. 3 other sacrifices were different ways of saying sorry to God. So here an Israelite would offer up the lifeblood of an animal while confessing that their sin has created more evil and death in God's good world. But instead of destroying this person, God, of course, wants to forgive them. And so this animal symbolically dies in their place and atones, which means it covers for their sin. And so through these rituals, the Israelites were constantly being reminded of God's grace, but also of his justice and of the seriousness of their evil and its consequences. The second set of rituals lays out the 7 annual feasts of Israel. And each of these retold a different part of the story about how God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And by celebrating these feasts regularly, Israel would remember who they were and who God was to them. Now, the sections about Israel's priests, you have Aaron and his sons first ordained to enter into God's presence on behalf of Israel. And then in this matching section, we find the qualifications for being a priest. The priests were called to the highest level of moral integrity and ritual holiness because they represented the people before God, but then also represented God to the people. Now, we find out why the priest's holiness matters so much back here in this first section. Right after the family of Aaron was ordained, 2 of his sons waltz right into God's presence and flagrantly violate the rules. And so they are consumed by God's holiness on the spot. It's a haunting reminder of the paradox of living in God's holy presence. Because it's pure goodness, but it becomes dangerous to those who rebel and insult God's holiness. And so it's important that Israel's priests become holy, and also that all of the people of Israel become holy, which is what the next inner sections are all about. Chapters 11 through 15 are about the ritual purity required of all the Israelites, and chapters 18 through 20 are about the moral purity of the people. Here's what's underneath all of this purity and impurity language. Because God is holy, and he's set apart, the Israelites need to be in a state of holiness themselves when they enter into his presence. This was called being clean or pure. God's presence was off limits to anybody who was not in a holy state, and this was called being unclean or impure. Now, an Israelite could become impure in just a few ways: by contact with reproductive body fluids, by having a skin disease, by touching mold or fungus, or by touching a dead body. Now, for the Israelites, all of these were associated with mortality, with the loss of life, which gets us to the core symbol of all these ideas. You become impure when you're contaminated by touching death, so to speak. And death is the opposite of God's holiness because God's essence is life. Now, this is really key. Simply being impure was not sinful or wrong. Touching these kinds of things was a normal part of everyday life. And impurity was a temporary state. It just lasted a week or 2, and then it's over. What was wrong or sinful was to waltz into God's presence carrying these symbols of death and impurity on my body. Don't do that. Now, the last way of becoming impure was by eating certain animals. And the kosher food laws are found right here in this section. Now, there have been lots of theories about why certain animals were considered impure and off limits. To promote hygiene or to avoid cultural taboos, the text just isn't explicit. But the basic point of all of these chapters is really clear. Altogether, these work as an elaborate set of cultural symbols that reminds Israel that God's holiness was to affect all areas of their lives. This corresponding section over here is about Israel's moral purity. The Israelites were called to live differently than the Canaanites. They were to care for the poor instead of overlooking them. They were to have a high level of sexual integrity, and they were to promote justice throughout their entire land. Now here at the center of the book, we find a long description of one of Israel's annual feasts, the Day of Atonement. Odds are that not every Israelite's sin and rebellion would be covered through the individual sacrifices. And so once a year, the high priest would take 2 goats. One of these would become a purification offering and atone for the sins of the people. And the other was called the scapegoat. The priest would confess the sins of Israel and symbolically place them on this goat, and then it would be cast out into the wilderness. Again, this is a very powerful image of God's desire to remove sin and its consequences from his people so that God can live with them in peace. The book concludes with Moses calling Israel to be faithful to all of the terms of the covenant. And he describes the blessings of peace and abundance that will result if Israel obeys all of these laws. He also warns them that if they're unfaithful and dishonor God's holiness, it will result in disaster and ultimately exile from the land promised to Abraham. Now, if you want to see how Leviticus fits into the big storyline, it's helpful to look at the first sentence of the next book of the Bible, Numbers. It begins, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent." So we can see that Moses is now able to enter God's presence on behalf of Israel. The book of Leviticus, it worked. So despite Israel's failure, God has provided a way for their sin to be covered, so that God can live with sinful people in peace. And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about. The book of Numbers. This 4th book of the Bible carries forward the story of Israel after their exodus from slavery in Egypt. God had brought them to Mount Sinai, and he entered into a covenant with them there. And despite Israel's rebellion, God had graciously provided a way for Israel to live near his holy presence in the tabernacle. So the book of Numbers begins as Israel wraps up their 1-year stay at Mount Sinai, and they head out into the wilderness on their way to the land that God promised to Abraham. Now, the book's storyline is designed according to the stages of their journey. So the first section begins at Mount Sinai, but then they set out and travel to the wilderness of Paran. And then from there, they travel to the plains of Moab, which is right across from the Promised Land. Now, the first part opens with a census where the people are numbered. That's where the book gets its name. And then there are laws about how the tribes of Israel were to be arranged in their camp. So the tabernacle was to be at the center, and then around that, the priests and the Levites, and then around them, the 12 tribes neatly arranged with Judah at their head. Now, this was all an elaborate symbol about how God's holy presence was at the center of their existence as a people. This is all followed by a whole series of laws that develop the purity laws from the book of Leviticus. If God's presence was going to be in their midst, every effort should be made to make the camp pure, a place that welcomes God's holiness. In chapter 10, the cloud of God's presence lifts from the tabernacle and guides Israel away from Sinai out into the wilderness. And immediately, things go terribly wrong. So in chapter 11, the people start complaining about their hunger and thirst and how they want to go back to Egypt. And then in chapter 12, Moses' own brother and sister begin opposing and bad-mouthing him in front of all of the people. This trip is not off to a good start. The next section begins as the Israelites arrive in the desert of Paran, about halfway to the Promised Land. And God tells Moses to send out the 12 spies, one for each tribe, so they can scout out the Promised Land. So when the spies all return, 10 of them say that there is no chance Israel can survive there because the Canaanites will destroy them. But there are 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who say that God can save them. But the 10 whip up the people into a fearful rage, and they start planning a mutiny. They're going to appoint a new leader and head back to Egypt. So God is understandably angry, and Moses intercedes on the people's behalf. He calls God to be faithful to his promises to Abraham. And so God does, but not at the expense of his justice. He gives these Israelites what they want, to not enter the land. And God sentences this generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they die. Only their children will get to enter the Promised Land. Now you'd think this severe consequence would wake them up, but it gets even worse. So in the next story, there's a whole group of Levites that begin a rebellion. And they challenge Moses and Aaron's leadership, saying that they have gone way too far. So God deals severely with these Levites, and he renews his commitment to Moses and Aaron as Israel's leaders. Now as they leave the region of Paran and hit the road, it goes downhill yet again. The Israelites start complaining again about their thirst, and they ask why Moses even brought them out of Egypt in the first place. So God tells Moses to speak to a rock to bring out water for all of the people. But Moses doesn't really do this. He oversteps his bounds. He hits the rock twice and then says, "You rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock?" So Moses dishonors God by putting himself in God's place as the one who brings out the water. And so Moses brings down on himself the same fate as the wilderness generation. He too will die in the desert and never get to enter the promised land. After this, the Israelites rebel yet again, and God brings a very strange judgment on them, venomous snakes to come and bite the people. And so Moses again intercedes on behalf of the people. And God tells Moses to do this, to make a bronze snake and to lift it up on a pole, so that whoever looks at this snake would be healed of the poisonous snake bite. It's a very strange symbol. But it speaks to the challenge that God has by being faithful to his covenant. He's right to bring justice on the Israelites' evil and sin. But even God's justice gets transformed into a source of life for those who will look to God for healing. From here, the people head into the plains of Moab. And the first main part of the section focuses on the strange figure of Balaam. So the king of Moab is freaked out at this huge group of people traveling through his territory. So he hires a pagan sorcerer, Balaam, to pronounce curses on Israel. And 3 different times, Balaam finds that he cannot curse them. He can utter only blessing upon Israel. Remember God's promise to Abraham from Genesis 12. So not only can Balaam not curse Israel, but God actually gives him a vision about a future Israelite king who will one day bring God's justice to all of the nations. This vision recalls Jacob's promise to Judah in Genesis chapter 49. Now it's worth stopping to reflect on the flow of the book so far. The rebellion stories in the wilderness, they just heap up on one another, getting worse and worse. And while God does bring partial acts of judgment on Israel, he's also kept showing mercy, providing food and water along the way. And so the Balaam story, it shows God's grace in bright colors. Because here's Israel. They're down in the camp, grumbling and rebelling. But up in the hills, unbeknownst to them, God is protecting and even blessing them. And it's this contrast between Israel's rebellion and God's faithfulness in the wilderness, that's what made these stories so important for later generations of Israel. So the wilderness stories are retold time and again by later biblical prophets and poets, and even by the apostles in the New Testament. And these stories always serve as a warning that while God will remain faithful to his covenant promises, he will also allow his people to walk away in rebellion and face the consequences. After this, the rest of the book focuses on the children of the wilderness generation, and they begin preparing to inherit the promised land. They take another census of the new generation, then they go on and win a number of battles with the people groups around them, and then a few tribes even begin to settle in the promised land. So the book ends with the new generation poised to enter into the land, and Moses is about to deliver his final words of wisdom and warning. But for now, that's what the book of Numbers is all about. The book of Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Bible and the final book of the Torah. After the exodus from Egypt, Israel was at Mount Sinai for 1 year, entering into a covenant with their God. And then they had the disastrous road trip through the wilderness, and the Exodus generation disqualified themselves from entering into the land promised to Abraham. And so Deuteronomy begins with Moses standing in front of this new generation, explaining the Torah. And it's from here that the design and purpose of the book unfolds. Deuteronomy is a series of speeches from Moses where he's calling the next generation of Israel to be faithful to the covenant with their God. At the center of the book is a collection of laws, which are the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Some of the laws are new, but many are repeated from the laws given earlier at Mount Sinai. And that's actually where this book gets its name. from a Greek word deuteronomion, which means a second law. Now, surrounding these laws are two outer sections of Moses' speech. Each of these are broken up into two parts themselves. Let's just dive in and we'll see how this whole thing works. So Moses, first of all, summarizes the story so far, and he highlights how rebellious the previous generation was, in contrast with God's constant grace and provision in the wilderness. And God did bring his justice on them, yes, but he did not abandon his covenant promises. After this comes a series of very passionate sermons where Moses calls on this new generation to be more faithful than their parents were to the covenant. He reminds them of the Ten Commandments, and then the centerpiece of this section is a famous line called the Shema. Moses says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." This became a very important daily prayer in Judaism, and it brings all of the themes of the book together. So the word listen, or Shema in Hebrew, it means much more than just to hear. Its meaning includes responding to what you hear, or in English we would say obey. And the word love in Hebrew also means much more than just an emotion or feeling. It's about a decision of wholehearted devotion to God that involves your will and your emotions, your mind and your heart. Now, for Israel, their obedience and devotion to God served a much larger purpose. Obedience to the laws is going to make Israel a unique people among the nations. Just like God said at Mount Sinai, they will become a kingdom of priests. And Moses now says, how? Israel has the chance, by following the laws, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. The other key idea in the Shema is that Israel was called to obey and be devoted to the Lord alone. Or literally, in Hebrew, it says, the Lord is one. Now, in context, the point is that the Lord is the one God Israel is to worship and obey. Israel's about to go into the land of Canaan, where people worship idol gods that represent all different aspects of creation: the sun, the weather, sex, and war. And in Moses' view, worshiping these gods degrades humans and destroys communities. But worshiping the God of Israel, who's the creator and the redeemer, that will lead to life and blessing. And so we come to the large collection of laws at the center of the book. And they're roughly arranged by topic. So the opening section is about Israel's worship of their God. They were to have one central temple where one God would be worshipped. And also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for its poor. So, for example, all Israelites were to set aside 1/10 of their annual income to be given to the temple. But another 10th was to be set aside every 3 years and given to the poor. And these are the kinds of laws that put Israel on the cutting edge of justice in comparison to their ancient neighbors. And it was all bound up with their worship of God. The next section outlines the character qualities of Israel's leaders. So the elders, the priests, the kings, these were all placed under the authority of the covenant laws, which God said that he would enforce by sending prophets to keep the leaders accountable. So in contrast to Israel's neighbors, where kings were thought of as divine and a law unto themselves, Israel's leaders were subordinate to the law and the prophets. Following this is a large section of laws about Israel's civil life, so rules about marriage and family and business, and also about social justice, about their legal system and how it was to protect widows and orphans and immigrants. And then these are concluded by more laws about worship. Now, here's some tips for reading all of these laws. Remember, first of all, these are the terms of the Sinai covenant given specifically to ancient Israel, living in a culture that's very different from yours. And so, two, it's not going to be helpful to compare these laws with modern laws from a very different culture. Rather, these were given to set Israel apart. And so we need to compare these laws with those of Israel's neighbors, like in Assyria or Babylon. And when you do that, all of a sudden laws that seemed harsh or bizarre become much more clear. You see that God is pushing Israel to a higher level of justice than was ever known before. And so finally, try to discern what core principles of wisdom or justice underlie any particular law. And you'll discover some really profound things. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go and see how Paul the Apostle does this very thing in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 9. And he quotes a law from Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verse 4. It's really interesting. So back to Moses. After he goes through all of the laws, he issues a final challenge that Israel should listen to and love their God. He first issues a warning and an ultimatum. If Israel listens to and obeys their God, everything's going to go great, lots of divine blessing. But if they don't listen and rebel, famine, plague, devastation, and ultimately exile from the land. And then Moses forces a decision. He says, "Today I set before you all life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. So choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him. But then Moses says this. He says, I know that after I die, you're going to rebel and turn away from God and end up in exile. Which is kind of a downer. But then again, he's been with these people for decades, and it becomes clear that his hopes are not very high. But all is not lost, Moses says. One day, when Israel is sitting in exile, at any point, Moses says they can turn back to their God, who will, in his words, circumcise your hearts so that you may love him with all your heart and soul and live. Now, this is a vivid metaphor that's saying something is fundamentally wrong with Israel's heart. It's stubborn and hard. And it's the same thing wrong with the heart of all of humanity. This is going all the way back to the rebellion in the garden. Humans seized autonomy from God. They wanted to define good and evil for themselves, and they ruined God's good world as a result. But one day, Moses says, God is going to do something to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly listen to and love God from the heart and be led back to true life. And this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the hope for a new heart. So Moses ends his speech with a poem of warning and then of blessing, and then he walks up onto a mountain and he dies. And so the Torah draws to a close. All of the major plot tensions of the biblical story are in place, but left totally unresolved. So when is the descendant of the woman going to come and defeat evil? Or how is God going to rescue the whole world and bless all nations through this family? And how can God's holiness be reconciled with people who are continually rebellious? And how is God going to transform the hearts of his people? You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about.
Okay, how's that for a whirlwind tour of the last three books of the books of the Torah? Okay, so obviously there's so much in those in that part of Scripture, but let's just maybe talk about a few things. So I thought it was fascinating. I don't know if you caught the word he used describing the book of Leviticus. I think we touched on this maybe a couple weeks ago, but one of the things that's hard for us Westerners sometimes when we read the Bible, especially the Old Testament, specifically the Old Testament, is the way that the ancient Eastern peoples wrote, and they did have a certain style. And Leviticus is a great example of this. So he talked about the symmetrical layout of that book, and it's really interesting. I've also seen writers talk about that and analyze the scriptures. Even within these sort of bookend ideas, there's even other sort of loop back type of writing that happens. So to talk about something, then you kind of go on to something else, and then come back to something. But he mentioned those major bookends. If you sort of think of the two ends of the book, he talks about there's rituals at the beginning, rituals at the end. Then he has the priests that kind of go in one layer. There's sections about the priests, and then there's he's got what's the next one here? Oh, purity. Yeah. So the purity and holiness. There's sections kind of equal distance from each other, and then right in the middle was this long section about the Day of Atonement. So all the details. So just interesting. Just kind of maybe. Seeing that structure might be helpful as you're reading through, because it sometimes seems like it's all over the place, but it actually is organized in a certain way. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It was also, if you picked up, very interesting summarization of, there's so many rules and regulations, and I think we are blessed today that we are not under the old law, that we don't have to do all those things. We don't have tabernacle or temple worship, maybe better way said. We don't have that. But all those different rules, I kind of liked. I never really thought of it that way. The way he summarized, all of those different sacrifices in particular. There was a couple that were sacrifices you did to say thank you, and there were several, 3, I think, that were to apologize to God or for forgiveness. So interesting, very broad strokes, but that's a really easy way to understand all those different things that the Israelites had to do. What do you think? Did you catch what he said? There's 5 or 7, I think it is, 7 different feasts that the Israelites practiced. What was the main purpose of that, of those, doing those every year? What purpose did that serve? Did you catch that?
To teach them, to help them to remember God's grace and mercy.
Yeah, it was a reminder, right? It was a reminder, just, so we have, we partake of communion together, the Lord's Supper, and that's a weekly reminder for us, or some might argue that it's, there's different frequencies that are involved there, but nevertheless, it is a reminder of us to, for what Jesus did on the cross. The Israelites had these reminders of what God did. The Passover is a very obvious one that's very clear as to what that remembrance is, and kind of ties into to our communion a little bit. Okay, did you catch this? It's mentioned a couple times. Once when they were at Sinai, there's a reference to the Israelites becoming a nation of priests. And then what's the New Testament? What does that bring to mind in the New Testament about our age, if I can call it the Christian age? What about, where are the priests? What happened to the priests in our day and age?
We have become the priests.
Yeah, we've become the priests, right? Where's that scripture? Anybody know? It's 1 Peter 2:5. So we're a royal priesthood, and that's a big deal. We have Jesus as our high priest, and we have direct access to the throne of God, the grace of God. The curtain was torn in half when Jesus died on the cross, and so that's a really big difference between, I keep calling it the Christian age, but the Christian age versus the Mosaic age, let's just say. Direct access. And do you think people have really gotten the message of that, what that really means? And I'm kind of trying to lead you on here a little bit. But when you think about priests and Christians as a royal priesthood, do you think that idea has really sunk in or not?
No, I don't think so.
No. Yeah, why do you think? Why is that? What is it? What is it about us? They can't get that.
Priests were called to be an example, a more pure example to the people, and they were representing God to the people. And we, as Christians, are supposed to represent Christ and God to the people. So our lives are supposed to be an example of good and mercy and grace, because that's what God gives us, is mercy.
Yeah. So the principle there is kind of the same, but why don't we just relish that idea? Maybe
human nature.
Yeah, I think that there's something about us that you could just talk about a bunch of different things, but maybe there's a lot of responsibility, right, with that for one thing. So to live up to that standard, you consider yourself a priest. And maybe this isn't a bad thing, it seems maybe we do have a little bit of humility. It's hard for us to think of ourselves as a priest.
Could it be that we don't want to associate ourselves with the Catholics?
There's that, right. So the priests, the Catholic Church still, even though they will say, if you read their literature, they do agree that, because it's in the Bible, 1 Peter 2:5, we're all a royal priesthood, but they say there are sacraments and functions of the church that should be carried out by a priestly class or my 5-minute warning. So they still have that. But yeah, so we want to stay away from that. And so, but I think the idea it sounds like kind of a big title, but I think there's also a laziness about us that we kind of like having the the priest, right? We kind of like having the guy that has God's phone number, has direct contact, and can do things for us. Bill, did you have something?
Yeah, what I think about the Catholics too is that it's in 1 Peter where they take it for the Pope as being the main overseer of how the Catholic Church operates.
Yeah, so they take that to the extreme, but he's the vicar of Christ.
And to build on your point, there's a spectrum out there of people who might want to be self-starters and
Yes.
who are ambitious, and then not that way. Some of us might find that hard to believe, but in the role of the legal departments, for example, there's some legal secretaries out there that I've encountered, and that I try not to hire now, where they're like, look, I am a robot. You tell me what you want, put on a piece of stationery that you sign. I'm not thinking about it. I don't care about the deadlines. So you tell me what to do, and I will do it. Well, if that's true of that job, there's other people out there that are like, look, I don't want to be this high priest thing. That someone needs to tell me, this Sunday be here, do this, and then you'll be okay. Your sins are gone. And we need to understand when communication.
Yeah, so there's
that's scary to think about.
Yeah, it's a great. We all have sort of different, leanings and bents. So there's some personalities that they want to be the king, right? They want to be the priest, and they're happy to do that. Others of us maybe we're happy to we'd like someone else to deal with that stuff, and then there's everything in between. So anyway, it's a little bit like when Israel wanted a king in Samuel 8, I think it is, where they wanted a king, and all the nations around them had a king, and so God was not pleased with that because God was he was to be their king. So anyway, it's just interesting that you can see this thread in the Torah.
So a very, very mild point on that. We Americans tend to be descended from people who said, I don't want no stinking king.
Exactly.
And so some of us, like when we lived in England, I'm surprised that people are like, well, the king says, the king will tell us. We're very happy the king is in charge. And I, of course, would be like, what? No. There's different groups and cultures still out there today.
So let's just, in our last minute here, let's kind of go with that. So in Deuteronomy, this is in the Hebrew. These are the words, or Deuteronomy means a repetition of the law. So there's all these laws, and it's a the Israelites, everything about them was really different and that was God's idea, than all the pagan nations, idol worship and all these crazy things that were happening there. And so they were a nation of laws, and they were to have God as their king. In our American history, to piggyback off of Bob's point, you probably heard people say that we're a nation of laws, and we're not, because what's the problem with the king? What's the problem with that?
You are at their mercy, quite literally.
Yeah, he is the law, right? The guy wakes up on the wrong side of the bed and I'm taxing you all double this year or whatever, or I don't like this, and off with your head. You say the wrong thing. So the idea of principles and laws, the founding fathers of this country wanted to go in that direction. They knew what it was about. They knew human nature. They knew that people were not basically good, and so a lot of people say, "Oh, people are basically good." I mean, our whole country was set up for a moral and just people, moral, educated population. So that's a different topic, but. On the other hand, it was set up with checks and balances because they knew people were not basically good. And so we can see that the Israelites were given all these laws. And just to wrap up here, because we've heard this word on our Wednesday night class in the Chosen. Did you pick up that word, Shema? They've said it probably 10 times in the Chosen series. The Shema, so they refer to that as the greatest commandment, which is not one of the 10 commandments, interestingly, but thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, etc. But what was brought out in this video is really good. The Shema is not just this idea; it just means to listen, but it means to listen and do something. So it's like you said, you tell your kids, why don't you ever listen to me? You never clean your room. you're implying that it's not just hearing, but it's listening and doing something about what you just heard. That's very important, and that carries over into the New Testament. And that's not salvation by works, but it is this idea that faith is not just intellectual belief. So we'll kind of leave it at that. But I think this guy did an amazing job to cover those three books in 23 minutes. So to get the big picture there. So, but again, the big thing, it's God is holy. There's a call to faithfulness to His rebellious creation, and it's all about we still have free will. I think you can see that a lot in the Scripture. We're not robots, and so it's hard for us because we have those choices, and we're in a physical body, but we also have a spiritual side to it. So, with that, I'll give somebody the last word if they have any last comment.
Hey, Howard,
Yeah.
I think that the confusion of faith in the New Testament has always been that they're not willing to drop the Old Testament. They want to continue. So many faiths want to continue what.
Yeah, it's an issue. I would say that's a problem for some. Yeah, because and there's something comforting about the temple worship, right? There's a set of things you do. You do X, Y, Z. You can check the box, and there's a guy in charge of that. And if you do those things, you can see those things, and that we sometimes try to carry that over into the New Testament Christianity, if you will, and Jesus is a whole different thing, and it's on a different plane. It's a spiritual thing. Obviously, there are things we do, there are actions we do, acts of worship, acts of faith, etc. But temple worship was fundamentally different, in a lot of ways. So yeah, we try to mix those things, and Paul was dealing with that in the book of Galatians, right? It was not very, they weren't very far from their Jewish roots, and they kept trying to go back to that. And the guys that used to practice or had practiced that for generations didn't like it that there was another way to worship. So with that, let's wrap up, guys, and so we'll be back in about 10 minutes.